The first laugh landed just as Staff Sergeant Nora Hale placed her gloved hand on the ballroom door, and by the time the second one reached her, every inch of her old army dress uniform felt louder than gunfire. Two young soldiers in ceremonial blues stood near the registration table, trying and failing to hide their amusement as their eyes moved over her faded ribbons, the hand-stitched cuff on her left sleeve, and the jacket that no longer hung with the sharp, perfect lines expected at a room full of officers. One of them murmured something about a museum piece. The other smirked and looked away too late. Nora pretended not to hear, but humiliation had its own sound. It was the sound of a grown woman standing perfectly still while strangers decided, in one quick glance, that she did not belong. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Let me know in the comments. I always enjoy seeing people from around the world joining these stories. And if stories about courage, sacrifice, and humanity mean something to you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows of the Naval Academy banquet hall in thin, impatient streaks, as if even the weather wanted her to turn around and leave before anyone else noticed her. Nora almost did. Her fingers tightened around the cream-colored invitation tucked beneath her program, the one stamped with a seal she had not seen up close in 15 years. She had read it so many times the paper had softened at the folds. Attendance respectfully requested. Formal recognition ceremony. Original dress uniform, if available. That last line had bothered her the most. Not formal uniform. Not service uniform. Original. As if whoever sent it wanted every old scar on the fabric to be visible. As if the past had not been invited merely to attend, but to testify. At the registration table, the civilian hostess looked down at the list, found Nora's name, and lost color in her face so quickly that Nora noticed it before the woman spoke. "Staff Sergeant Hale?" she asked softly, as though confirming the identity of someone long expected. Nora nodded. The hostess swallowed and handed her a heavy card trimmed in gold. Row 1. Seat 3. Not the back corner where forgotten guests were usually placed. Not a table for veterans' widows or retired enlisted or clerical invitees. The front. Close enough to the podium that every expression would be visible. Close enough that if there had been some mistake, it would become public in seconds. Nora glanced toward the rows of white-covered chairs and felt the old reflex stir in her chest, the instinct to make herself smaller before someone else did it for her. She had not wanted to come. She had not wanted to take the uniform out of the garment bag where it had hung for more than a decade in the back of a closet that smelled faintly of cedar and dust and old winters. She had not wanted to see if it still fit, and she had definitely not wanted to discover that it did, though differently now, a little tighter across the shoulders, a little looser at the waist, like a life remembered more clearly than it deserved. Her mother had repaired the left cuff by hand at the kitchen table years ago after Nora came home from the Pacific. "I'm not fixing it to make it disappear," she had said, threading the needle beneath a weak yellow lamp. "I'm fixing it so it holds." Her mother was gone now. The stitch remained. So did the dark, uneven shadow above it where smoke had once sunk into the cloth and never fully left. The soldiers who had laughed were still near the entrance when Nora moved into the room. She could feel their eyes on her back, and that somehow hurt more than if they had laughed again. The ballroom glittered with polished brass, crystal water glasses, rows of service caps balanced on laps, ribbons bright under chandeliers, and enough rank to make most civilians forget how small a single person could feel. Conversations rolled through the room in low, educated waves, acronyms, reunions, names of commands, references to mutual friends and old deployments. Nora knew that language once. She had lived inside it. Now it felt like passing a house where the lights were on, but nobody inside would recognize you through the window. A Navy commander appeared at her side before she reached her seat. He was silver-haired, sharply composed, and carried the kind of face military life carved into men who spent years learning how to say hard things without moving much at all. "Staff Sergeant Hale," he said, offering a respectful nod. "I'm Commander Brooks. Thank you for coming." The phrasing was strange. Not welcome. Thank you. As though her presence had required more than travel. As though arriving had itself been an act of service. Nora searched his expression for a clue, but all she found was restraint. "Am I in the right place?" she asked. It was the only question she could trust not to betray more than she meant to. Commander Brooks looked at the seat card in her hand, then back at her face. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Exactly the right place." That did not make her feel better. It made her feel watched. She sat in the front row with her back straight and her hands folded, one thumb pressing against the other to stop the small tremor she hoped no one would notice. On the stage stood a lectern, the flags of every military branch, and a table draped in deep blue velvet. On that table rested a framed citation, an open box lined in dark satin, and something else half covered by the folds of a white cloth. Nora could not make out what it was. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Every ceremony had its choreography. Every hidden object meant a moment the audience was not supposed to see coming. Across the aisle, two retired Marines were studying her ribbons with the distant interest of men sorting memory from protocol. One of them frowned, not contemptuously, but as though he recognized something he could not yet place. The feeling crawled up Nora's spine. If people in this room knew who she was, then she was the only one still missing the reason. 15 years earlier, she had known exactly who she was. Back then, she had been the kind of soldier who moved fast without appearing hurried, who could hear panic in a voice before the words themselves fell apart, who could pack trauma dressings in the dark, who wrote careful letters home and never mailed half of them, and who still believed the uniform meant that effort and integrity would eventually be seen. She was 30, a combat medic on temporary assignment with a joint humanitarian task force in the Western Pacific after a typhoon shattered a chain of islands hard enough to erase roads, schools, and entire neighborhoods in a single night. The mission had been rescue first, treatment second, sleep never. Sailors, soldiers, Marines, medics, pilots, engineers, everyone on that ship had carried exhaustion like an extra layer of skin. The storm had left behind broken piers, contaminated wells, and children who stared at military helicopters with the same expression adults used for miracles they did not fully trust. Nora had trusted one man on that deployment sooner than she expected. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Alvarez was older than she was by nearly 20 years, thick-voiced, broad-shouldered, and impossible to intimidate. He had the calm of someone who had already seen enough emergencies to stop wasting time on fear. He showed her where the sailors kept the extra blankets for evacuees, where the coffee was strongest after midnight, and which junior officers needed their instructions repeated in fewer syllables when things got loud. He talked about his wife, Rosa, and his little boy back in San Diego so often that Nora felt she knew the child's laugh before she ever saw the photograph tucked inside his wallet. "Do the work in front of you," he used to say whenever the deck got chaotic. "Then do the next right thing. Hero talk comes later." Lieutenant Daniel Reeves was different. He was brilliant in the way institutions reward, precise, disciplined, ambitious without being arrogant about it. He carried his responsibilities like something breakable, which in a young officer was either a virtue or a warning, depending on the day. Nora liked him because he listened when she spoke, and because he never used rank to avoid doubt. There was a seriousness to him that didn't come from ego. It came from conscience. In another life, under gentler circumstances, he might have been easy company. But disaster zones have a way of forcing every relationship to reveal itself at the speed of crisis. You learn who people are in fragments, in the way they hold a flashlight, in whether they kneel before speaking to the injured, in whether they remember names the next morning. The night that changed all of them began with exhausted relief. They had spent 16 hours bringing civilians aboard from a village the storm surge had nearly eaten whole. Mothers with salt-stiff hair, elderly men who would not let go of family photographs sealed in plastic bags, children wrapped in blankets too big for them, smelling of seawater and diesel in shock. The hangar bay had been converted into a temporary shelter, cots lined in rows beneath harsh lights, pallets of bottled water stacked beside medical crates, and tarps rigged in corners for privacy that wasn't really privacy at all. The storm had moved north, but the sea was still throwing itself against the hull. The ship groaned in long metallic breaths. Around midnight, Nora was checking a feverish little boy when the first shout tore across the deck. At first it sounded like the 1,000 other urgent voices that fill a ship during a rough operation. Equipment call, supply issue, stretcher needed. Then the second shout came sharper, followed by the kind of alarm no one mistakes once they've heard it enough. Fire. For a moment, everything sped up and slowed down at the same time. Sailors moved toward the compartment. Civilians panicked away from it. Someone killed the music from a nearby radio. The smell reached them before the smoke did. A thick electrical burn laced with fuel, bitter enough to sting the throat from half a deck away. Lieutenant Reeves was already shouting orders, pushing evacuees toward the safe corridor, assigning damage control teams with clipped efficiency. Nora grabbed her aid bag and ran. What she remembered most later was not the heat. It was the knocking. The fire had started near a bank of portable generators and spread faster than anyone expected through stacked supplies and soaked canvas. Sprinklers burst above them, turning the air into steam and ash. Visibility collapsed. Someone yelled that a fuel line ran behind the bulkhead. Someone else yelled that if the compartment wasn't sealed, the whole section could flash. Reeves stood at the hatch with a radio in one hand and a flashlight in the other, his jaw set so hard it looked painful. He had already pulled 2 sailors out himself. One of them was coughing blood into a towel. "Seal it," an officer behind him said. Reeves didn't answer right away. Then Nora heard it. 3 dull bangs from inside the smoke. Not metal settling. Not gear shifting. Deliberate. Uneven. Human. "There's still someone in there," she shouted. Reeves heard it too. She knew he did because his face changed. Not into fear. Into calculation. The cruel kind of calculation command sometimes demands, when the seconds you spend hoping are the same seconds that may kill everyone else. "We can't keep this open," the damage control chief snapped. "Sir, if that line goes." Another knock. Then what might have been a child's cry, thinned by smoke. Nora did not wait for the order. She moved before the argument finished forming, ducking beneath the half-lowered hatch with her shoulder turned, one gloved hand over her mouth, the other reaching into black heat for something she could not yet see. Someone shouted her name. Another hand caught the back of her jacket and missed. The world inside the compartment shrank to noise and sparks and the violent hiss of water hitting flame. A little girl in a red raincoat was crouched beneath a cargo net. Frozen so completely, she looked sewn into the dark. Beyond her, a sailor was pinned under a toppled equipment rack. Nora dropped to her knees, dragged the child toward her, and heard the hatch behind her grind open another desperate inch. Miguel Alvarez came through first. He should not have been there. He had every reason to stay outside, to follow procedure, to protect the rest of the ship. Instead, he shoved a breathing mask toward the girl, braced one shoulder under the fallen rack, and barked at Nora to move the child before they lost the little time they had left. A third figure burst through the smoke a heartbeat later, Lieutenant Reeves, cursing himself and everyone else because conscience had finally outrun protocol. It lasted 3 seconds before the ceiling answered for all of them. A burst of flame rolled across the upper pipes. Something heavy snapped loose. Reeves turned his head toward the sound just before metal struck him hard enough to send him down. The flashlight spun away, and then they were working inside darkness broken only by red emergency strobes and the wild orange pulse of fire finding oxygen. Nora got the girl clear first because children cannot wait while adults decide what matters more. She pushed her toward the hatch, shoved her through waiting hands, and went back. The pinned sailor was semi-conscious, leg mangled, uniform soaked. Miguel had enough of the rack lifted for Nora to drag the man free inch by inch, both of them slipping in water and foam and spilled fuel. Reeves was trying to rise and failing, blood in one eyebrow, breath ragged. Somewhere outside, men were yelling for them to get out now. Somewhere inside, something was beginning to scream the way machines do just before they fail. Nora hooked her arm under Reeves and hauled. He protested once, some officer reflex about the others, and then the rest of his words vanished into coughing. She almost made it. That was the part she saw in sleep for years afterward. The hatch no more than 12 feet away. The light beyond it. Reeves sagging against her shoulder. The injured sailor half dragged by the back of his vest. And Miguel, still behind them, because the broken beam above had shifted and pinned one side of the passage. He shoved the sailor forward with the last clean strength in his body and looked directly at Nora through heat and smoke and noise so violent it no longer sounded like separate things. "Move, Sergeant," he said. It was the only order from that night she obeyed. The explosion that followed never became a full detonation. Damage control teams prevented that, and the official reports would later say their quick action saved the ship. They were right, but reports like being right in narrow ways. The truth was uglier and more personal. Nora stumbled through the hatch with Reeves and the sailor just as the compartment coughed fire into the corridor. Hands pulled them clear. The hatch sealed. People shouted for stretchers. Medics swarmed. Someone tried to take the little girl from Nora and discovered Nora was still gripping the child's sleeve, so hard her knuckles had gone colorless. Reeves was alive. The sailor was alive. 6 evacuees and 2 crew members had gotten out because the compartment stayed open 20 seconds longer than procedure allowed. Miguel Alvarez did not come out. By dawn, the ship had resumed tree-off. That was military life at its most brutal and most ordinary. Grief compressed by duty into whatever shape the next task required. The dead were honored. The living kept moving. Nora worked 2 shifts with a bandaged arm and smoke trapped in her lungs, then sat alone beside a maintenance ladder long enough to realize her left sleeve had burned nearly through at the cuff. Reeves found her there after sunset, his own head stitched, his face carrying the gray fatigue of a man who had already begun replaying the part of the night he would never publicly finish. He thanked her once. She told him not to. He apologized once. She told him not to do that either. Neither of them said Miguel's name at first, because some losses are too large to step over with formal language. The inquiry started 3 days later. No one in uniform fears paperwork the way civilians imagine they do. What they fear is what paperwork becomes when institutions need clean explanations for messy moral events. Nora sat before a review board in a pressed temporary jacket and answered questions about unauthorized entry, command compliance, risk assessment, and operational discipline while men with careful voices turned the worst night of her life into a sequence of boxes that could be checked. Lieutenant Reeves testified too. So did the damage control chief. So did the doctors who treated the evacuees. No one lied exactly. That would have been easier to identify and easier to condemn. Instead, the truth was narrowed, simplified, reshaped into a version the system could survive. The official findings said Staff Sergeant Nora Hale had entered the hazardous compartment without authorization after hearing unconfirmed distress signals. It said Chief Petty Officer Miguel Alvarez had moved to assist in rescue efforts once the breach had already occurred. It said Lieutenant Reeves had attempted recovery operations under emergent conditions. It praised courage. It cited loss. It attached a formal letter of reprimand to Nora's file for failure to obey a direct safety order. She would not be court-martialed. She would not be publicly disgraced. She would also not be promoted on time, and everyone who understood military careers knew what that meant. Reeves came to her before the findings were finalized. He met her in a supply passage near sick bay where the fluorescent light made everyone look more exhausted than they already were. He held the draft report in his hand like it might burn him. "This is wrong," he said. Not loudly, not theatrically, quiet enough that the guilt had room to breathe inside the words. "Alvarez chose to go in. I followed you in. You didn't force any of it." Nora looked at him for a long time, then asked the only question that mattered. "If you change it, what happens to his line of duty status?" Reeves didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew what scrutiny could do when institutions started deciding whose heroism had technically violated which procedure. They both knew what delayed benefits could do to a widow with a toddler. Rosa Alvarez came aboard for the memorial service 2 weeks later. She wore black, held her son against one shoulder, and thanked every person who spoke to her with a composure so pure it made everyone else feel clumsy. Nora watched her from a distance before finally stepping forward. Rosa already knew her name. Miguel had spoken about the Army medic with steady hands and stubborn eyes. He had mentioned her in letters, once in a late-night call from port, and apparently more often than Nora ever guessed. When Rosa took Nora's hand, there was no accusation in it. No searching, just exhausted gratitude and a grief too deep to perform. The child on her shoulder, little Tomas, was asleep with one fist curled against his father's folded flag. Nora looked at that tiny hand and understood, with a clarity almost physical, that truth is not always the same as justice when other people are forced to live on what survives it. So she signed. She signed the acknowledgement. She accepted the reprimand. She let the rumors settle around her the way all military rumors do. Half-known, quietly damaging, impossible to fully correct once people decide they've heard enough. Some thought she had been brave, but reckless. Others thought she had been emotional because children were involved. A few thought Reeves had protected her from worse. Nobody outside a very small circle knew that Nora could have defended herself completely if she had been willing to let the dead be interrogated harder and the living be punished with what remained. She chose silence, and silence, like service, had a cost that continued collecting long after the event itself was over. Her career never quite recovered. She finished her enlistment, declined the performance smiles of administrators who wanted things neat again, and left active duty with honorable paperwork and a future that no longer resembled the one she had once imagined. Her father had already died by then. Her mother's health began slipping the year after. Nora moved back east, took work first in emergency medicine, then at a veterans outpatient clinic where men twice her age sometimes called her Doc, with a tenderness that felt like being seen and not seen at the same time. She never married. There had been chances, and then there hadn't. Life did what life does. It kept arriving in ordinary demands until the extraordinary parts became a private country nobody else visited. And then, 15 years later, the invitation came. No explanation, no phone call, just the seal, the date, the request, and the line about her original uniform. She almost threw it away. Then she almost ignored it. Then she spent 3 nights staring at it on her kitchen counter beside a coffee mug gone cold, wondering who would summon an old staff sergeant to a hall full of admirals and captains and generals unless somebody intended either to honor the past or reopen it. She told herself she was going only to find out which. On the drive north, she kept the garment bag laid flat across the back seat like a patient who might stop breathing if jostled too hard. Now, sitting in the front row while silverware chimed softly on china and conversations thinned toward ceremony, Nora felt the years collapse inward until her chest carried both versions of herself at once. The woman who had learned to live without answers, and the soldier who still wanted them more than she admitted. An usher closed the ballroom doors. The band near the back straightened. A hush spread from table to table not because anyone demanded it, but because rank itself had entered the room. Admiral Daniel Reeves walked to the stage beneath the flags with the measured pace of a man accustomed to being watched and not at all accustomed to what he intended to say. Time had changed him the way oceans change stone, slowly, visibly, without erasing what was always there. His hair was white now at the temples. His shoulders had the formal weight of command. But Nora recognized the same eyes immediately. Eyes that listened before they judged. Eyes that had once opened through smoke and pain to find her dragging him toward light. He began with the expected courtesies, gratitude to the Academy, acknowledgement of veterans, welcome to families. His voice carried cleanly across the room. People relaxed into the script they thought they understood. Then his tone changed by half a degree, which in men like him is the difference between ceremony and confession. There are moments in military life, he said, when the record keeps up with the truth. And there are moments when it does not. Tonight is about one of those failures. A small ripple moved through the audience. Not sound. Attention. Reeves did not look at his notes again. 15 years ago, during a humanitarian mission in the Pacific, a fire broke out aboard a joint task force vessel carrying crew, medical teams, and evacuated civilians after a typhoon. The official report from that night documented bravery under extreme circumstances. It also documented a disciplinary breach by one soldier whose actions were described as unauthorized. He paused. Nora could feel the room beginning to turn toward her before most people knew why. For 15 years, that account remained in the file. For 15 years, it remained incomplete. And for 15 years, one person carried the weight of that incompleteness without asking to be restored. The soldiers near the registration table had gone utterly still. Nora did not move. She could not. Her whole body felt like the fraction of a second before impact, when instinct tells you something irreversible has already begun. Reeves stepped away from the lectern. Staff Sergeant Nora Hale, United States Army, attached medical support. Would you please stand? The request traveled through her like current. She rose because training outlives certainty. Dozens of heads turned fully now. Some faces were politely blank. Some were confused. A few, especially older ones, had already guessed enough to look almost stricken. Nora kept her eyes forward. She would not give the room the spectacle of visible fear. Not after all these years. Not after coming this far in that uniform. Reeves descended the short steps from the stage and stopped an arm's length away from her, so close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the effort it cost him to keep his voice steady. "I was the lieutenant on duty that night," he said. No one in the room breathed normally after that. "I gave the order to seal the compartment," he continued. "And when Staff Sergeant Hale heard survivors still inside, she moved before I did." He let the words settle. Not dramatic, not embellished, just true. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Alvarez followed her because he would not let her enter alone. I followed them both, because by then conscience had outrun protocol. Staff Sergeant Hale evacuated a child, an injured sailor, and me after I was struck in the compartment. Chief Alvarez died as a direct result of his own courageous decision to hold that passage long enough for the rest of us to reach the hatch. The official record did not say that clearly enough. In one crucial respect, it did not say it at all. The silence that filled the ballroom then was not empty. It was crowded with everything people were rethinking at once. Reeves turned so the entire room could hear him. Staff Sergeant Hale had the opportunity to contest the report. She did not. She understood that reopening the findings the way they should have been reopened might place Chief Alvarez's line-of-duty status and his family's immediate support at risk during a period of review. She also understood that I, as a young officer, had failed to insist that the full truth remain attached to my name from the start. She protected the dead. She protected the living. And she paid for that protection with her own career. A woman's quiet cry broke from somewhere behind the fourth row. Nora did not need to turn to know who it was. Rosa Alvarez was seated near the aisle, hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone pale against her skin. Time had thinned her face and silvered her hair, but Nora knew her immediately. Beside her sat a young man in midshipman white, shoulders straight, jaw working as though trying not to tremble. Tomas. The sleeping child with his fist against a folded flag had become a man old enough to wear a uniform of his own. For one dizzy second, the room blurred around the edges. That was the deeply personal cruelty and mercy of military life. Years vanish, and then they do not. One glance proves they happened. Reeves gestured gently toward the velvet-covered table on the stage. Commander Brooks lifted the white cloth away. Beneath it rested a shadow box. Inside were a soldier's medal, newly mounted orders, corrected commendation records, and a smaller frame containing an old photograph Nora had not seen in over a decade. The humanitarian task force deck at dusk, evacuee cots in rows, Miguel Alvarez leaning against a bulkhead grinning at the camera, Reeves young and sleepless beside him, and Nora in the center, squinting into salt wine with that same left sleeve darkened at the cuff. The audience saw the photo. Then they looked back at the uniform she was wearing. The past was no longer abstract. It stood in front of them with visible stitching. "I requested that she come in her original uniform," Reeves said. And now even the youngest soldiers in the room looked as though they wished the floor would open beneath them. "Because I wanted everyone here to understand something that military culture forgets at its own peril. Honor does not always arrive pressed, polished, and admired. Sometimes it arrives worn thin by years of silence. Sometimes it carries burn marks. Sometimes the uniform you laugh at is the uniform that walked back out of fire carrying other people's lives." No one glanced away from Nora after that. In the back of the room, several veterans removed their glasses. One old Marine bowed his head. A colonel in army green shifted, as if ashamed on behalf of a generation, or maybe two. The two soldiers at the registration table had lost every trace of arrogance. They were barely more than boys. Nora saw that now. Boys who had measured worth by shine and fit because they had not yet learned how much fabric can hold. She did not hate them. The strange thing was, in that moment, she pitied the smallness that ignorance lends people before life teaches them the cost of easy judgment. Reeves turned back to her, and for the first time his composure cracked enough for the human being beneath the Admiral to show. "Staff Sergeant Hale," he said softly, though the microphone carried it everywhere. "I asked you here tonight because the delay in this recognition is not a flaw in your service. It is a flaw in ours. I cannot return the years your record was allowed to remain incomplete. I cannot restore what silence cost you. But I can do what should have been done long ago. On behalf of a grateful service, and on behalf of one officer who has carried this debt for far too long, I am asking your forgiveness, and I am giving you the salute I should have given you before the smoke ever left that ship." Then Admiral Daniel Reeves came to attention in the middle of the ballroom and saluted her. It was not quick. It was not symbolic. It was the clean, formal, unmistakable salute of a man who knew exactly what he owed and who had chosen, finally, to pay it in full before witnesses. The image struck the room like weather. Chairs scraped. People stood. Soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, retired spouses, civilians, cadets. Everybody rose as though pulled upward by the same invisible line. Some saluted. Some placed hands over hearts. Some simply stood in tears because they understood they were watching one of those rare moments when an institution, for a single breath, became worthy of the people who had suffered for it. Nora returned the salute, but her hand shook on the way up. The trembling did not diminish the moment. It made it unbearable in the best possible way. Because strength is not the absence of shaking. Strength is what a person does while shaking. Her eyes found Rose's, then Tomas's. Then, unexpectedly, a woman 3 rows back in Navy Nurse White's who was already crying before anyone else understood why. The woman lifted one hand to her chest and nodded once. Around her wrist was a thin red bracelet, child-sized, preserved like a relic. Nora stared at it and felt the floor disappear beneath memory. The little girl in the smoke. The red raincoat. The child she had pushed toward the hatch first because children cannot wait. Grown now. Serving now. Alive. That was when the tears came. Not dramatic tears. Not collapse. Just the sudden surrender of a face that had held too much in place for too long. She lowered her salute and pressed her lips together. But there was no controlling what relief does when it finally arrives after years of being denied. It moved through her in waves. Grief for Miguel, gratitude for Rosa, astonishment at Tomas, shame remembered, and then broken open. The old wound of being misunderstood, the deeper wound of having learned to live with it. Reeves stepped forward and placed the metal case in her hands with the care one, gives something already sacred before it's touched. Commander Brooks read the corrected citation, voice steady while half the room fought to hear through emotion. It spoke of conspicuous courage, selfless disregard for personal safety, life-saving actions under catastrophic conditions, and the preservation of civilian and military lives during a humanitarian crisis. It formally acknowledged Chief Petty Officer Miguel Alvarez's voluntary rescue action with honor undiminished. It struck the reprimand from the historical summary attached to Nora's service record. It did not erase the lost years. Nothing could, but it changed the story the file would tell after she was gone. In military life, that matters more than civilians sometimes understand. Records outlive bodies. Truth in a record is a form of burial done correctly. When the reading ended, Tomas Alvarez came forward in his white uniform, no longer the sleeping child from the memorial, but not quite free of him either. He stopped before Nora with the rigid dignity of a young man fighting tears in public because he had been raised by someone who taught him both restraint and feeling. "My mother wanted me to be the one to stand here tonight," he said. His voice almost held. "She said my father used to tell her that if he ever had to trust anyone with the worst day of his life, it would be you." Nora closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them, and saw Miguel in the shape of the son he never got to watch become a man. Tomas swallowed. "Thank you for bringing part of him home." There are sentences that take years to arrive and still reach a person exactly when they should. That was one of them. The room remained standing for a long time after the ceremony should have resumed its normal shape. People needed the extra seconds. So did Nora. The applause that finally came was not loud in the shallow, celebratory way some crowds clap to perform enthusiasm. It rolled deep and sustained, heavy with respect, the kind of applause that sounds more like acknowledgement than entertainment. Somewhere in it, the bandmaster quietly lowered his head. Somewhere else, one of the young soldiers from the entrance wiped at his face with the back of his hand and hoped nobody had noticed. Everybody had. What happened afterward mattered almost as much as the salute. The ceremony ended. People began to move. Conversations rose in stunned, hushed fragments. Chairs shifted. Glasses clinked again, but softer now, as if the room itself understood it had changed registers and could not quite return. Nora stepped away from the front row with the metal case held close against her body. Rosa met her in the aisle before anyone else could. They embraced without elegant words, without trying to condense 15 years into something tidy. Grief that old has no patience for performance. Tomas stood beside them with one hand over his mouth and the other holding his mother's elbow. The young nurse in white approached next. "I'm Anna Cruz," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. I don't remember your face from that night. I only remember your hand pulling me. That was enough to break whatever remained of Nora's composure. And for the first time in many years, she let herself be held by the proof that what had been saved had continued living. Then came the apology she had not known she needed. The younger of the two soldiers from the doorway approached slowly, almost boyish despite the uniform. Up close, he could not have been more than 23. His name tag read Cole. He stopped at a respectful distance, shoulders tight with embarrassment that had matured, in a single evening, into self-knowledge. Staff Sergeant Hale, he said, the title careful now, earned in his mouth by shame. I owe you an apology. Nora looked at him. Really looked. He was not a villain. He was a young man in a polished uniform who had not yet had his illusions corrected by enough life. We shouldn't have laughed, he said. There's no excuse for it. His voice went rough. I didn't know. No, Nora said. It was not harsh. It was true. He nodded once, accepting that truth, and glanced down in the way people do when they are hoping sincerity might still matter after the damage is done. One of his ribbons had shifted slightly out of line during the long ceremony. Nora saw it because old habits never leave soldiers. Without thinking much about it, she reached out and straightened the row with two gentle fingers. The gesture startled him more than anger would have. Now you know, she said. Carry that better than you carried the joke. He swallowed hard and nodded again, eyes bright. And in that small moment the story changed not just for her, but for him. Humiliation had been interrupted by grace. That kind of correction lasts. Later, when most of the guests had drifted toward receptions and photographs and careful conversations about history, Nora slipped out into the stone courtyard beneath the academy lights. The rain had ended. Everything smelled washed clean, wet brick, trimmed hedges, old flag fabric damp in the wind coming off the water. She stood alone for a minute with the metal case in her hands and let the night settle around her without asking anything else from it. The same uniform that had drawn laughter at the doorway now carried a different weight against her shoulders. Not lighter, just truer. She thought of her mother's needle moving through burned cloth. She thought of Miguel's final order. She thought of Reeves standing rigid before her with the apology only rank had delayed. She thought of Rosa surviving long enough to witness this correction. She thought of little Anna in a red raincoat becoming Lieutenant Cruz in Nurse White's. For the first time in years, the memory of that night in the Pacific no longer ended with a sealed hatch. It ended with people still living. Commander Brooks found her there eventually, but he knew enough not to speak right away. He simply stood a respectful distance away until the silence between them became companionable rather than cautious. The Admiral wanted me to tell you, he said at last, that some debts take a career to understand. Nora gave a faint, tired smile. And some payments arrive late. Brooks nodded once. Late, he agreed, but not absent. That distinction mattered more than she expected it to. There are wounds that do not need time reversed. They need the truth spoken aloud in the place where the lie once stood. That had happened tonight. Not perfectly, not early, but publicly, which was its own kind of mercy. When she finally walked back toward the parking lot, the corridor by the entrance was empty except for a janitor folding tablecloths and one forgotten service cap resting on a chair. The ballroom lights behind her had softened to gold. Somewhere inside, people were still telling each other what they had witnessed, shaping it into memory while it was fresh enough to matter. Nora paused at the doorway where the laughter had first found her. She placed her hand for a moment against the repaired cuff of her sleeve, not to hide it, not to smooth it, but simply to feel the seam her mother had left there. Holding, not disappearing. She understood now why the invitation had asked for the original uniform. Because some stories cannot be corrected in polished replacements. They need the fabric that survived the fire. Real honor is not measured by how quickly it is recognized, but by how faithfully it is carried when no one is watching. And as Nora stepped into the cool night, the same worn sleeve that had once drawn laughter moved through the wind like a flag no one would ever mistake again. If this story stayed with you, and if it reminds you that courage, sacrifice, and quiet integrity still exist in this world, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. And if you felt something during this story, I'd love to know what stayed with you most: the apology, the salute, the sun, or the sleeve that carried the truth all those years.